versus kind of branding. But what we're trying to represent here is there's a few different places that we can be when we land in security versus usability. I think where we want to be is the top right, where we have a highly secure solution and it's usable. Users won't mind the solution being secure as long as it's usable is where we want to be. If we're in kind of low security and it's horribly unusable, that's really where we want to avoid, and that's the painful place to be. And the one that we're most likely going to hit security incidents is going to be the top left, where we have, it's not very much locked down at all, and users kind of can do what they want. And at that point, we're likely to have security incidents.
I think just the last thing to call out is this bottom box near me here as well. If your security is locked down too much and you make teams inherently unusable for people to work how they want to, this is where we risk people going off and using things like WeTransfer or Dropbox or other third-party systems which you can't control and you can't secure, and that's something that we do see quite a lot of as well.
Yeah, and Zoe's spot on that. A lot of the guidance I've given today is really around we want to keep people in teams. We want to keep the collaboration happening in somewhere that we can control is the important thing. We don't want to make it so heavily secured that usability suffers and our users want to go somewhere else to basically share or collaborate is the important thing.
All right, so if you think about this from a user perspective, and again, we'll keep this bit quite brief, what is it that users want to be able to do? Now, I think the top one, so I need to be able to work safely from anywhere. And actually, if you look at the past 18 months, this isn't just about working safely from anywhere. This is about working safely from any device, any browser. We've seen people through the pandemic who, due to chip shortages and supply chain issues for laptops and other equipment, trying to work either as students or employees on, really old crappy laptops or mobile phones. So what we need to be able to do is to make sure that people are safe, regardless of how or where they're working. As a user as well, I also need to be confident that my data is protected for me. I'm just a bog standard user, I work in finance or something like that. I don't understand records management, I don't understand labeling. I don't understand what the rules are necessarily that I need to comply with from an information protection standpoint. So what I need to know is that if I follow what IT tells me and I just work following the governance guardrails they've put in place, that my data is just going to be protected for me in line with their policies. And then lastly, I need to know that only the users have access to the information that should do. So, if I'm working in an external team, I need to know that it's external and I need to know that the stuff in there could be visible to people outside my organisation. And likewise, in an internal team, I need to know that as well. I need to have confidence that my data isn't being exposed, because again, from a usability perspective, as soon as people lose confidence in this, they're just going to stop working in the way that we want them to, and they won't adopt and they won't get the benefits out of the platform.
And I think from the kind of back-end security side, the IT administration side, what we really want to know is what are the components that are available to us, how can we configure them, how can we set them up, and how can we do that at scale? How can we make it work for us as well as the users, the important thing. So what can I do in terms of self-service? What can I do in terms of governance and kind of scaling this up?
Cool, all right, so this is the last bit before we get into the tech and how we should be configuring this. And this is just a look at the responsibilities that we've got for keeping our data, our systems, and our people safe. Now, before we get into this shared responsibility model, and again, apologies if you heard this story yesterday, but there's a really useful analogy that we've got that brings this to life a little bit. So I want you to imagine you're driving down a dark country road late at night, you're going too fast, and you don't have your seatbelt on, and a car pulls out in front of you. And you crash into them, you don't hit the brakes, you crash into them, you have an accident. Now in that scenario, whose fault is it that you have crashed your car? Is it your fault for not putting your seatbelt on and not hitting the brakes? Or is it the manufacturer's? And I think in that example, we all understand that that manufacturers put safety features into cars, but as the driver, it's your responsibility to use them. And it works in a really similar way from a Microsoft 365 perspective.
And I think, how long that analogy will hold up with autonomous driving, we don't know, but for the moment it still works is what I would say. Now, I think Zoe's spot on here, and I think what we've got in the traditional on-premise model, we can see your customer management and risk just here is entirely on you is the thing. As we move further right, we can see provider management and risk, so that's Microsoft taking on the responsibility here. And that comes with physical security, hosting structure, network controls, application level controls, until we kind of get to identity and access management, which is entirely on us, so how we access our systems and the identity surrounding that is entirely on us. There is a split responsibility between client and endpoint protection, and then the data that goes within or into Microsoft Teams or Microsoft 365 is entirely on us. And like Zoe said, there's an implicit trust that we have on our provider or the manufacturer of the car, that kind of, we rely on them for the physical security, the hosting infrastructure. There's a trust that's built in, so it's a shared responsibility model is what we're trying to get at here. All right, now, normally what I would do is I'd have a quick diagram of the architecture of Teams. And the reason I typically put that up is just to kind of run through the breadth and the depth of kind of the technical components that we need to secure. So as we want to spend more time on the technical components, I'm going to glance over that, but suffice to say, Teams is a wide-ranging product. It's built on a platform of various different technologies and services, including Exchange Online, SharePoint, OneDrive, we've got the Skype public network, there's web apps for Office, there's a whole heap of different things, Azure AD. We could go on and on. The slide is very complicated, and again, it didn't really work out well with Compost colors, but you know, the idea was to try to showcase that. Now what we've got is a number of different components, and the components I typically like to look at are the ones that we saw in the top right. So the ones I'm looking at specifically are going to be around data classification, accountability, client and endpoint protection, and identity and access management. Those are the ones that really do it for me in terms of better securing Teams. Now, as I go through the components, Zoe's going to come and ask me hopefully some challenging questions around usability is what I would say. Now, most of the questions she's asking are quite out of the way, but she might have cooked up some special ones for today, is what I would say.
What I would say as well, though, is don't leave the hard questions to me. If you've got any questions to put Luke on the spot, feel free to chip in. All
right, so the first one that I love is very close to my heart. It's one of my favorite technologies that we have available within 365 is Azure AD Conditional Access. Now, what I would say is, look, this is the who, what, why, when, where of how you access your, I guess, resources within Microsoft 365. Now, it's a simple if this, then that. That's really all there is to it. You know, if I'm a user, if I'm in the finance department, if I'm accessing Microsoft Teams, do we want to block access? Do we want to allow access? Do we want to enforce MFA? It's really a granular level of control of how people can access and consume basic Microsoft Teams for your organization. And there's a lot of breadth and depth. There's a huge variety of what you can do here. Again, I was reading some really interesting stuff last night on LinkedIn. Some guy at Microsoft, I'll share it on my LinkedIn later today, but he's produced an excellent guide on, you know, some very detailed configurations for conditional access. What I would say though, and for most of the technologies, I typically have a brief bit about the technology and recommendations that I would take away today and look to implement if you have that technology available. So what we're trying to say here is, look, we have the simple what if, or if then that, and we can allow or deny access. And the things that we're really iffy on is the location. It can be from an IP range of a country. It can be on GPS coordinates now, which is really cool. We can do device states. If you're using Microsoft Pt2, we can say whether a device is compliant, managed, unmanaged. We can use Defender, and again, that's on device state. We can say kind of a risk level of that device. We can see a user group, so it depends what they're in. And also, if you have a higher level SKUs, we can make use of kind of the identity protection, and we can make use of risks. So risk basically on user sign-in, or basically a sign-in risk. And I'll come to that in the next slide. But the key thing that I want to take away from better securing Teams here, I've kind of drawn up a quick recommendation of 4 things that I would do immediately today is the thing. So these are the kind of takeaways for conditional access. Now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but you want to enable MFA if you haven't got it. Now, by default, new tenants are getting something called security baseline, so they get it automatically. But by the long chance you haven't got it, switch on MFA. You know, all elements you should be protected by MFA in some way, shape, or form is what I'm trying to get at. 99% of attacks can be basically mitigated using MFA. The next one, we want to get rid of legacy auth. So legacy auth, the difference between legacy and basically modern is the interactivity of the sign-in. So legacy auth is just simple username and password, and basically it's vulnerable to attacks. So we would disable that using conditional access is what I recommend. The next one is a very easy one. We've got allow or deny countries, and we can use basically Azure AD, conditional access, to basically allow sign-ins or block countries. And again, this is that GPS and location of the IPs that I spoke about in the previous slide. But what we want to do here is we can make some real simple changes to cut out a large volume of, I would say, superfluous or dangerous kind of sign-ins. And we can, if we work within a specific country, we could just allow sign-ins from that country for our normal users and not guests. Now, if we wanted to do something, if we, the big gotcha with that one is typically people going on holiday, and I know they should be working, but quite often they might sign in and they want access. So what you might want to do is take a slightly different approach. And in that scenario, what we're going to do is we might want to set up countries that we don't want authentication coming from. Now, according to the NCSC guidance, I'm pretty sure the countries we wish to deny access to at the moment are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. The boys on the naughty step is what I would say. So we would typically deny access to them. And the final one is a bit more flash, but you would need kind of an endpoint or Intune in there. And we can basically start making use of things as device controls. And this is really powerful. But it's probably for a slightly more heavily regulated environment where you may wish to have just people that are on a corporate device accessing your Microsoft 365 services or Microsoft Teams. Again, we have a control over the user type, so we can target people that are members of our Azure AD tenant, so people that are within our organization, or it could be guests, so we could basically say we don't want to apply these controls to guests. And those are my top 4. Now, normally when you set up conditional access, I will share on my LinkedIn, you might have 20, 30 rules, it depends. If you want to get really fancy, you start building personas, and it's really very, very powerful stuff. It's infinitely customizable. I would just suggest sticking with a simple baseline to get you going, and don't go too crazy to begin with.
And what about licensing for these features, Luke?
Okay, that's a good question, Zoe. Thank you for that. And I'm going to call that very quickly here. The big one you got to watch out for is the risk sign-in here, is the important one. And risk is really derived on identity protection, which is Azure AD Premium P2. And we also have machine level risk, which is going to be under the center endpoint. And those are the kind of ones. Other than that, it's Azure AD Premium P1. I hope that most of you guys have EMS or P1, in which case this will be available to you, except for the risk.
We've got a question.
Oh, sure, shoot. Oh, gosh. Oh.
Making me work for it today.
Thanks. So regarding disabling legacy auth,
Yes.
which I agree with, by the way,
Okay.
what would you recommend for accounts that you need for automated processes?
Okay, good question. So I think there is always a way around that, and the way I would typically do that is the following, is that if you know where these automated accounts are coming from, I would typically add them as an exclusion for the legacy auth policy, but you can also enforce them to come from a single IP, yeah? So you can spin up another rule and say, look, I'll allow this user to authenticate with legacy auth, but from only these IP.
So using the location as the second factor?
Yeah, so yeah, that's the way I typically target it. Alternatively, a lot of the time people are using these in terms of legacy auth, it's typically SMTP, so I set up an SMTP relay and push it, basically.
Okay.
A lot of MFA, multifunction devices, all that sort of stuff is the ones typically we recommend SMTP relay.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Lovely, thank you. All right. The next one is kind of identity protection, and basically Microsoft analyzes, and I don't know how accurate this is, but 6.5 trillion kind of authentication requests, and that comes from Sky, it comes from the live web network, Xbox Live, Microsoft 365, Azure AD, there's a whole heap of kind of these authentication requests coming in. They can basically look at these at scale and try to understand different signals to kind of classify the risk of the sign-in. We can kind of use the kind of volume at scale that Microsoft's using with these sign-ins, and basically use the data that they have to identify sign-ins that may be considered risky. So whether it's a user sign-in or a sign-in risk, we can use this to basically feed into tools such as conditional access, like I showed on the last slide, or Sentinel to kind of trigger remediation or further investigation. Now, the things that we're typically looking for as part of identity protection: anonymous IP address, unfamiliar sign-in properties. A typical travel is a good one. So if Luke's signing in from London and he signs in from China, 2 hours later, we want to make sure that we're kind of catching that. And the others are quite easy: leak credentials, malware linked IP address. The idea here is that we can use these signals to better feed into kind of the tools available across the stack. Now, what would I recommend for identity protection to best secure teams? This is kind of the one. So I'd switch on identity protection for all users except for your break glass accounts, typically, is what I would say, because we don't really want to break glass accounts being messed with. I would set up policies for sign-in risk and user policy risk. For the user risk, I'd block in sign-in to high. So if it's a high user sign-in risk, we would block that entirely. For a sign-in risk, basically, for just this normal sign-in risk for medium and above, I'd allow, but I didn't enforce MFA. I'd also look to use identity protection to enforce MFA registration. So again, continuing that theme of MFA, what we really want to do is use Azure identity protection to basically automatically use these signals that are coming from Microsoft, better automate and identify risky sign-ins and block our users or enforce MFA.
So if we've got a user being blocked for high risk,
Yeah.
you know, obviously that's likely to be an account that is at risk, but from the actual real life person's point of view,
Yeah.
what is it that they'll experience?
So what they're going to experience is an interesting one. It is obviously going to have an impact on usability, but it's going to pop up with a box saying basically your access is denied. You can't get to that resource at the moment because your sign-in was basically considered too risky. In that scenario, they're most likely going to have to call the help desk and have their password reset or their account unblocked. So that one does have an impact. But I think the benefits in this scenario outweighs the negatives. And the reason being is that it's an automated process. You don't have to do anything really. It's mainly just going to be the remediation that you guys are dealing with. It all happens kind of in the background. As long as you've got it configured, it's going to work for you. It's just going to be the user tidy up really when people get caught out. And I've seen this work plenty of times before because we have seen basically users trying to sign in from Zimbabwe, China, wherever it may be. We see all the password attacks coming in. Is the thing. So this one's really powerful. And you don't really want to be dealing with, you know, this stuff. When people are attacking in the middle of the night, you kind of want the system in place to deal with that. This one is an Azure AD Premium P2 feature, but it's well worth it if you have it available. Okay, the next one's a nice easy one. It's slightly more user-friendly and based on user.
Sorry, Luke, we've got a question at the back.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
Do you want to throw the box?
where's the queue?
Last slide.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, so on your last slide you had a high risk. So
Yeah.
a lot of the high risk that we see is basically users logging in between different countries. In other words, impossible to travel. And it basically swamps the log.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's down to the fact that we're a global company and we've got people that log in on VPN.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so they're logging in on a computer in the US, and then basically, how do you get around that?
Oh gosh, that is a better one, you know.
Thanks for the hard question.
That is a tough one. I don't know if I have the exact answer, but for me, you know, there's a few different scenarios. One, I obviously wouldn't want to exclude them from that. I don't know if we have, and I'm going to cheat here, I don't know if we actually have, I don't think we have the ability to kind of say it's basically allowed networks or typical travel. I don't think there's an easy scenario for that one. I don't have any answer for you.
It doesn't work, does it?
You're killing me here. No, but in all seriousness, I don't have an easy answer for that one. I think if they are going through the VPN, the best thing you can probably do is look for allowed networks or trusted networks and conditional access. But I don't think that's going to solve the answer to this identity protection. So thank you for the question. I don't have an immediate answer. I don't think there's a way in technology to do it yet. You could split tunnel deals, but that's kind of changing the network at that point. There's a way in the technology. Yeah, that's a network problem at that point. So yeah, you could split tunnel deals. But I have a lot of organizations that want a tunnel. A full tunnel is the problem when it's very high secure. Now, obviously, again, that would make it easier. But those, yeah, that's a networking one. So we'll pass the buck on that and move on. But I haven't got an immediate solution for you in identity protection, unfortunately. All right, the next one is access reviews, and I'll probably keep it quite lightweight on this because I have recommendations. But this is more a user-driven one. And the idea here is that we can create access reviews with an Azure AD to basically evaluate and review the membership of our teams. And we can use this technology to basically have it be self-reviewed. We can have it so it could be manager-driven. We can have it so it's basically system automated. Now, what I would say is this could be on a continuous basis, like a rolling review. The idea here is we're kind of removing people that no longer need access on a recurring basis. Now, that's a very high-level technology. What I would say for kind of the reviews or the recommendations, I would typically roll this out basically either for reviews on guests initially, so reviewing your guest members across the organization, or a pilot is typically what I like to do on a number of groups that kind of know this is coming. I would be careful of the reviewers don't respond, because if you set that in the wrong way, if they don't, if people just ignore it and don't bother, they can automatically lose access to the group. So we would typically watch out for that one. I would make use of the automatic reviews and system recommendations that come in, and basically allow the system to look at who's actually using these things and suggest based on that. And you can see in the bottom right here, we've got accept recommendations from the system. So you can see this is it in practice and how it might look. The user's not last signed in for 30 days, we're going to deny access and you can accept recommendations. And I think for me, this is going to make it easier to kind of manage this on an ongoing basis and basically cut down the number of superfluous users within a team. I think the other thing is you probably, once you're up and running, set up a rolling review for every X amount of time. What is a sensible kind of thing? I mean, I think every 30 days is a bit overkill. Maybe every 6 months to a year is probably a sensible one. Go for it. Oh gosh.
How does that get reflected in the audit logs?
I'm pretty sure that the access reviews actually has an audit log you can go and look at and see exactly what happened at any given review. And if you missed a review, for example, you can go back and replay that. Have you got a good one for me? I'm ready.
Yeah.
What's oh god.
I looked at this.
Yeah, okay.
And I rejected it because I looked at access reviews. Access reviews is good, but for guest users, it doesn't give you the things that you need. So for a guest user, you need a expiry date.
Yeah.
You need a owner.
Yeah.
And you need a sponsor.
Okay, I get it.
And none of the guest reviews fit that business case because you invite somebody or you allow everybody in Teams, the accessibility part of it. You can't get a Teams, there's not the functionality in Teams, so you've got to block guest access to Teams.
Okay.
So if you go to your tenant and you say, right, no one can invite anybody.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Because if you allow everybody to invite everybody, you end up with thousands of guest users and no owners and no security owners. And then how do you then secure your SharePoint sites and your data within SharePoint? You can't do it.
That's why I think I have a few answers for that one actually. So
the way I worked it out is you can't do that. So I blocked it all and then created a SharePoint list and a Microsoft form so people could request a guest account. And I couldn't use this access reviews, which could be brilliant, but it didn't give the ownership and the review to say, you've had this account's 3 months old now, it's due coming up to review. A sponsor, do you want this guest to still have access?
So I think on that one, the owner, I would typically delay it, I would probably split out the Teams owner, is what I would say. As for the kind of ownership, yeah, that goes on that. I think how they've been invited is an interesting one. I'm pretty sure there's a feature in SharePoint Online where we can say you can remove ownership for guests every X amount of time. I'll go for it. What's the? Oh, we've got the.
You probably want to be looking at entitlements.
Yeah. Oh.
So entitlements will take it.
You're killing me, Alan. Okay. So the next one, we will come back to Alan, see what he's got to say, but what we typically say on top of that, the next level on to access reviews is kind of entitlement management. Entitlement management is the bundling of kind of different resources, whether it's an app, whether it's a SharePoint site, whether it's a team, and bundling them together, or it's a group, and bundling them together into an access package, and we can manage that access package at a higher level. And again, it's very similar to an access review, but we're bundling resources together and managing it in that way. Now, Alan, what was we use an entitlement manager. I wonder if it was in.
You can use this, but you can have external sponsors. So you can have for external users, when they request access, you can have that two-step approval. First one going to an external sponsor, second one being somebody internal. So you can offload some of the approval process to somebody who knows from a partner organisation.
There you go. And again, the part we can call out entitlement management is that we can have the ownership of those access packages is typically what I would say. And that might not be, the key thing for me is getting away from IT owning all this and basically putting it onto the business. Because I don't know, Zoe doesn't know, Alan doesn't know, who should actually have access to these things. It should really be kind of business driven and business led. Now, there are features in SharePoint Online. If you don't have this, I think there is that room to manage external users, but that's SharePoint Online. Specifically, I get where you're coming from with some of that, and in other places I've been, we have a similar setup for inviting guests in. This is the one, but I'll talk about guests in a moment, if that's all right. Yeah.
And just on this one before we move on as well, so as well as the kind of guest access issue, the other thing that this is really useful for is joiners, movers, leavers, particularly the movers bit of it. And the way that it allows you to group resources together and apply them to people is incredibly powerful because, I mean, how many times have you had a new starter come in and you give them access to like the HR team and then they start and realise there's another 10 things that they need access to? If you group all of those things together, you can make sure that someone has access to the right stuff on day one. But the bit for me that's really powerful is the movers bit, because often you get people who move sideways into a different part of the business and they never lose access to the old stuff. So you might have someone who's maybe crossed an information barrier and you know they might have access to stuff that they shouldn't have in their new role. And if you can just remove the old entitlement and give them the new one, it automatically takes care of all of that for you.
There's also separation of duties, which is just...
That was my point. So the new feature that they've added very recently is called separation of duties. And the idea here is that we can basically target applications within entitlement management. So say if you're part of the sales department, there is a financial application, you might want to have a separation of duties to stop salespeople accessing financial order data, for example. And that's one of the new preview features that they come out with, which is really darn interesting, in my opinion. Now the next one, we kind of spoke briefly about identity. Next is kind of groups and teams around that and further identity. But this is a quick, easy one that I'll run through very briefly. But expiration policy, I'm hoping you've all got it switched on. This is another easy one that I recommend, is that we can have basically an expiry policy configured on teams. And basically people are using these areas, why we still retain them, why we still keeping them open, why we still having guests and externals coming into these things. And an expiration policy we can set up, and it used to be pretty naff, but now it's much more clever. It understands when a team's being used, it looks in the SharePoint site, Exchange mailbox, looks in the OneNote, and it's going to find if activities taking place in these areas. And if they're not, it will basically email the owner of that area and ask if they wish to renew it and keep it going.
I think on that point of it being naff, when this first came out, it didn't work in that way. So it didn't check whether things were still being used. And for some of our clients, we saw loads of important teams just vanishing because people had not looked at the emails.
Yeah, we'd send an email every 30, 60, 80 days, whatever you configured, and just ask if you want to keep it. If you didn't, it would delete it. So we had a number of people complaining that their team had gone missing on their SharePoint site because they missed the email.
I think there was about 70 or 100 on one day, wasn't it, when it first kicked in?
No, thankfully, they've improved this, and it's kind of smart, and it's looking at people actually using these things. Thankfully, it's much improved. I would get it on.
And licensing?
Licensing now is already premium P1, so if you're EMS, you should be covered. But it's a nice easy one to switch on, and it helps kind of cut out some of the crap that you've got looking around and people like you. Okay, this is the fun one, guests. So for me, switch guests on, that's the immediate one. Enable guest access today is what I would say. The reason I say that is we want the collaboration taking place in our tenant as opposed to WeTransfer, Dropbox, wherever it may be.
Or even the other organisation's tenant, if you're collaborating with someone externally.
We do have
it's better to have it in yours because you can switch off the access.
And I'll talk you through kind of government building and 365 tools in a moment, but we do have something called connected channels. I'm pretty sure it's the name. Is that the actual? I think it's connected channels coming up, which is a new interesting one. We have a channel shared between organizations, and I'm excited to see how that one works. But my main thing is I would switch it on. Now, when I say switch it on, I don't mean open it up to everyone and everything. It's more about what level you're comfortable with the guest access, the important thing. So when I say govern using built-in tools, I think there's a few different technologies and tools that we can use to make this work a bit better. And for me, they're going to be things such as the Azure AD allow and deny list, so we can control which organizations we want to invite in. We can also control who can invite guests using the guest inviter. Guest inviter role is the other important one. So we can have a group of people that can invite guests in if we want. So we can better control who can actually add them in. Obviously, we can manage those guests on an ongoing basis using access reviews and entitlement management. We can also, that's going to strip them out over a period of time. And I think, group assignments, it's more just kind of building upon what I said there in terms of that. So for me, I would switch it on. I would look at who can invite guests, what guests or what organizations guests can come from, and also how long guests should persist using kind of access reviews and entitlement management. And that's my take on guests. So I'd rather have it taking place and I can control it, rather than going outside my tenant is the important thing for me. All right, and that's kind of my identity and access management. The next one is really around content and that content ownership block. So the shared responsibility in the top right, we have the one around content management. And really what we're looking at here, again, it's a nice easy one, I'm sure plenty of you guys have come across, but sensitivity labels. What is a sensitivity label? It's a tag, it's customizable, it's clear text. And the key one for me is consistent. It kind of lives with the document. It doesn't matter where that document goes, it's going to stick with it. And when I say document, it could be PowerPoint, Excel, Word, Outlook, we can use it across the board, across the pieces, the important thing. Now, why is this really powerful? The great thing is we may have guests in the team, we may have people taking data out of teams. But if things are classified with a sensitivity label, what it's going to do is live with the document. So I can take that document, I can apply encryption to it, I can apply a watermark, I can make it basically self-destruct after a period of time if I want it. So we can disable offline access. And the great thing is, this is really the encryption is through by Azure Active Directory, so it's tied to an identity of who can access this document. And that's great. So it doesn't matter if people exfiltrate data, as long as it's classified appropriately, it's going to basically come with that document and prevent people from opening it on the outside. Now, that one's been around a while. This one's relatively new, but again, it's a very powerful feature. And this one, you've got to have slightly more trust in the users, is what I would say. But we can do sensitive labels at the container level. Now, this is really powerful because when we change the sensitivity of a team, we can apply different settings to that team. And the things that might happen there are, we might change the external user access from a SharePoint perspective. We may change external sharing from SharePoint sites. And we may change kind of guest access settings on the team. I think on top of that, we can also do some lightweight conditional access stuff. So if it's a highly confidential team, we might not want access from unmanaged devices. We may wish to not allow downloads, for example. And that's why this is very powerful. I think that the kind of gotcha, and I said we have to trust your owners, really is going to be, if you're an owner and they have the ability to change sensitivity labels, they're going to be able to change that automatically. So it's more about understanding whether or who should have the ability to change it. Now, what are my recommendations around sensitivity labels? Some of these are quite easy, but the key ones for me are that I would typically use different labels between documents and containers. Is the thing I don't think they necessarily blend well together. I don't think it kind of adds up. If you're using the Microsoft baseline kind of labels, watch out because they have one called public, and I don't know if that makes sense to everyone in terms of a public document. It's something that's kind of public to me. I would show to a pilot group and kind of train people how to use it is the one, and then use the kind of built-in reporting features to basically see who's using these labels, what's working and what isn't. Now I appreciate we're running kind of out of time, so the last ones I have really were endpoint kind of protection. I've only got I think 2 slides left. So DLP for Teams is an interesting one. I won't bother you with kind of DLP at a baseline from E3. We can use data loss prevention in Teams to kind of stop data exfiltrations is the important thing. So we have a whole bunch of sensitive information types built into basic Microsoft 365. We can use them on the right-hand side. What you're going to see here is basically stopping someone sharing credit card information, and we can block that in real time. Now the important thing here is that this is actually an E5 feature, and I don't know, I'm up to you, but the reason I think Microsoft charge is that they need real-time processing power to analyze messages as they're sent. That's at least my understanding as to why that is because the normal stuff in E3 is done on a call schedule and it happens over a period of time, and that can be scheduled in the background, whereas it's like in real time. So if you have the E5 feature, use the sensitive information types, and I have some recommendations of DLP in a moment. The other one that's really interesting to me is kind of data loss prevention for endpoint. This again is the E5 one, so this is the gated one, but we can kind of better control how data from teams is moved around. So you can see on the right hand side, we can stop people uploading to cloud services, so your Dropbox, your WeTransfer, wherever it may be. We can stop USB, Bluetooth, and stream on print and kind of remote desktop, and we can use that on Windows 10 clients and Windows 11 clients very shortly. You don't really need to do a great deal if you're using Defender for Endpoint that's basically ready to rock and roll. You just need to switch it on and get going with it. Is the thing. Now, the scenario this doesn't really cover is BYOD, and what we can fall back to there is kind of Windows information protection is another feature that's available. It's kind of hit and miss. I'm not entirely sold on it. I don't know the answers to BYOD devices with data loss prevention for endpoint.
Azure Virtual Desktop.
Virtual desktop. Yeah, I guess that is probably the one thing. Zoe. What I would say again is gated away is the thing. This one. So if you have the ability to use it, great. If not, then apologies. My recommendations, I've kind of taken a UK specific one here, but typically what I'd recommend is sort of any baseline setup is basically we would set up 2 baseline policies. One for basically all the UK stuff. We'd have one for a low number of hits versus a high number of hits, and depending, so if you have 10 or less, we'd probably just notify the users that we're sharing sensitive data. If you have 10 or more, you might want to block that and get your admins or security, information security team involved to have a look at when someone might be sharing 10 or 100 items outside the organization that are sensitive information types. And then kind of the final slide that we're wrapping up on. Zoe, do you want to rock and roll this one for a bit?
Yeah, sure. You know, we've looked at usability yesterday, we've looked at some of the technology today, and I think with some of the tools that we've got available from Microsoft, it isn't necessarily a case of one winning out over the other. It is possible to have a really highly secure platform which is usable, but there is a gotcha, and that's the licensing. So to get access to a lot of the really good stuff that can automate this, that can allow you to scale out, that can make it easier for your IT admins, there will be an element of premium licensing involved, whether that's E5, whether that's Azure AD Pt2. And I think, I mean, I'll let you talk about the kind of governance section. You know, I think it's a case of assessing what the need is for your organisation and which bits of the security aspect are going to help you out the most.
And I think, like Zoe said, what I would say, I kind of touched upon it very briefly, is all the things you can set up in the configure to better secure your teams, and you can see on the right hand side, you get E5. We've got the automatic classification of labels, we've got information barriers, communications compliance. There's a whole heap of things that we can go into and to talk about terms of use. But the real thing to have your cake and eat it, you're going to pay, because that's the kind of gotcha of the session, really. So there are ways and means. The other thing is you can kind of do some of this on your own. You can handle the code, you can use Graph, PowerShell, Power Automate to kind of build automated reporting for guests to do some of this, but some of this stuff is going to be near impossible to code out, to be very tricky. So things like automatic labeling is going to take a lot of time and effort to reproduce. And you want to close it out, Zoe?
Yeah, so thanks for joining, and thanks to those of you on the call. Thanks for some of the hard questions for Luke as we went through. That made my life a little bit easier. We haven't uploaded the slides yet, but we will do after this, won't we? So if anybody wants to go through a bit more slowly or thinks of any questions later, just give Luke a shout.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks very much, guys. We'll be around at the end if you have any questions. But thanks for listening. Appreciate it.